Good morning. Good evening. Good afternoon. And remember, context is everything. Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook cover to cover. And today, we're 3 episodes away from being done with the entire textbook. Every word written here on the Context is Everything Media Network. Pending copyright infringement when I get more followers. Talking about followers, here we sit at 69 followers. That's great. I'm happy with 69. Thank you all 69 of you for following. 70 would be great. 70 before the end of this book. 70 before the end of this week. That's the goal. I appreciate it. Thank you. Today, chapter 37, final chapter, section 2. Now, Latin America, the United States, and the world. Setting the scene. The duty of every revolutionary is to make revolution, declared Cuban dictator Fidel Castro in 1962. After bringing about sweeping changes in his island nation, Castro vowed to export communism to other countries in the region. During the Cold War, the threat of communist revolution had a strong influence on the United States policy toward Latin America. Today, Latin American nations are building new political and economic relations in the global arena. When this book says today, they're talking about 2001, when this book's copyright date is 2001. Communism in Cuba. New heading. That means I put on glasses to indicate this is a different heading. These are blue light glasses that I bought when I was a car salesman, sitting in front of a computer all day long. Communism in Cuba. New heading. After the Spanish-American War, Cuba won independence from Spain. However, Cuba was controlled by the United States under the Platt Amendment to the Cuban Constitution in 1935. During this time, American investors brought up Cuban plantations and mills, and the United States became a chief buyer of Cuban sugar. During this time, American investors bought up Cuban plantations and mills, and the United States became a chief buyer of Cuban sugar. It continued to support military dictators. Castro. In the 1950s, a young lawyer, Fidel Castro, rallied forces opposed to corrupt Batista regime. In 1959, Castro had led his tiny guerrilla army to victory. Cubans cheered the rebels as a hero. For many, the joy soon wore off as Castro turned Cuba into a communist state. Castro nationalized foreign-owned sugar plantations and other businesses. He put most land under government control and distributed the rest to peasant farmers. While Castro imposed harsh authoritarian rule, he did improve conditions for the poor. During the 1960s, Cuba provided basic health care for all, promoted equality for women, and increased the nation's literacy rate. The percentage of a population that can read and write the literacy rate is. Critics were jailed or silenced, and hundreds of thousands fled to the United States. Communist dictator shipped angered middle-class Cubans to the United States. Cold War tensions, and I think that is the plot of Scarface with Al Pacino, is the Cubans that are exported to the United States by design, by Castro's design, were not the law-abiding type. He wanted to get them out of the country. and so they left in a mass exodus, and that is the theme and setting of Al Pacino's Scarface. I gotta exercise a little bit more. Look at these arms, not very big at all. They don't need to be that much bigger, but a little bit, Cold War tensions. The Cuban Revolution alarmed the United States, especially as Castro turned to the Soviet Union for aid. In 1961, the United States backed a plot by anti-Castro exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. An invasion force landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, but was quickly crushed. The next year, the United States imposed an embargo on Cuba. An embargo is a ban on trade. Castro sought closer ties to the Soviet Union. He let the Soviets build nuclear missile bases in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The threat of nearby Soviet nuclear bases outraged the United States and touched off a dangerous crisis. Spooky. The Bay of Pigs, the Bay of Pigs, the Bay of Pigs. JFK. Right? In October 1962, President John Kennedy declared a naval blockade on Cuba and demanded the Soviet remove the weapons that they had. Several days during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the superpowers, United States and USSR, stood on the brink of nuclear war. At the end, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev backed down. He agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. Over the next decades, Castro tried to encourage revolution in other Latin American nations. Cuba also sent troops to Africa to help socialist government of Angola. In response, the United States continued its efforts to isolate Cuba and undermine Castro. The Soviets, meanwhile, provided massive economic and military aid to Cuba. Recent trends. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, Cuba lost its chief ally and trading partner. With Soviet financial aid, Cuba's economy fell into shambles. In response, Castro encouraged tourism, allowed some features of a market economy, and welcomed foreign investment. At the same time, however, he vowed to preserve communism. The United States refused to negotiate with Castro despite the urgings of the United Nations and Latin American leaders, who argued that Cuba no longer posed a threat. Still, as American business people visited the country and baseball teams from the two nations competed, it seemed less and less likely that Cuban communism and the American embargo would endure for long. Okay. Still going. Am I wrong? Cuban embargo. Is it still happening? I'm pretty sure it is. Let's do a little internet here. Cuban USA embargo. Cuban USA embargo. What? How'd that happen? How did that happen? Oh, somehow. What is this? Oh. How did that happen? If you could see the screen, I think that my spacebar was pressed, and as I was typing, it just put spaces between every letter. But perfectly between every letter, while I was typing with the spacebar held. That's interesting. I didn't know that was a thing. I just learned it here live. If I had a mirror, I would point the mirror here so you could see it on the screen that I'm looking at over here to see what I'm talking about. But otherwise, it doesn't really matter. Cuba has been under U.S. embargo for 60 years. The Guardian reports on February 3rd, 2022. That means that it is still under embargo, which it says here incorrectly. Still, as the American business people visited the country and baseball teams from the two nations competed, it seemed less and less likely that either Cuban communism or American embargo would endure for long. It is enduring. The United States and Latin America. New heading. Like powerful nations, many times and places in the United States developed a sphere. Like powerful nations in many times and places, the United States developed a sphere of influence that included smaller neighboring states. The United States was leading investor and trading partner of most of the nations in Latin America. Profits from the United States-owned companies flowed from Latin America into the North. At the same time, cultural influences drifted both north and south. Despite their links, the United States and its neighbors had very different views of one another. The United States saw itself as a defender of democracy and capitalism and the source of humanitarian aid. Many Latin Americans, however, resented that they lived under the shadow of the Colossus of the North. Intervention. During the Cold War, the United States intervened repeatedly in Latin America under the banner of the Monroe Doctrine. It did so to protect its interests and to prevent the spread of communism. The United States backed anti-communist dictators and helped equip and train their soldiers to fight rebel uprisings. It even helped topple leftist leaders. In 1954, for example, the United States helped Guatemalan soldiers overthrow a popularly elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. This action came after he had enacted land reforms that threatened the United States-owned businesses. In the 1970s, after socialist Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile, President Richard Nixon told officials to make the Chilean economy scream. In 1973, the United States quietly lent its support to a military coup that overthrew Allende. Other United States interventions in Latin America were unrelated to the threat of communism. In 1989, United States forces invaded Panama and overthrew the government of General Manuel Noriega. Noriega was removed from Panama and then tried, convicted, and imprisoned for drug trafficking. In the 1990s, the United States used economic pressure and the threat of military action to force military rulers from power in Haiti. Is extradition when you have the legal permission to have law enforcement get some guy or gal out from another country to pay for crimes in your country? Is that what extradition is? I think that's what it is. Yeah. Many Latin Americans opposed the United States' economic and military interventions. Although they perhaps admired the wealth and technology of the United States, they often resented its political, economic, and cultural influence in Latin America. Continuing, let me turn the page here. Regional organizations. Despite disagreements, Latin American nations and the United States did work together. The Organization of American States, OAS, was formed in 1948 to promote democracy, economic cooperation, and human rights. Members pledged to not interfere directly or indirectly for any reason whatsoever in the internal or external affairs of any other state. Although the United States often dominated the OAS, what an interesting promise to make. Although the United States often dominated the OAS, Latin American members did at times pursue an independent line. The Castro Revolution in the Cold War tensions led President Kennedy to launch the Alliance for Progress in 1961. Under this ambitious program, the United States offered billions in loans and investments. In exchange, Latin American governments were to enact genuine reform. The goals were to promote education and land reform, reduce inequality and poverty, weaken dictatorships, and help the countries avoid revolutions. The alliance produced little progress. Landowners and the business elite in many countries opposed the basic reforms. The United States provided aid to Latin America, but never on the scale proposed by Kennedy. New heading: Regional and global issues. But before that, does the Organization of American States exist still? Organization of American States. It has an address in Washington, D.C. So it looks like it still exists from April 1948 to today. Okay. Regional and global issues. And this is the final heading of today. Thank you. And if you're still here with me and you haven't subscribed, I appreciate your time. And I would also appreciate your subscription. That would be great. Thank you. By the end of the Cold War, many Latin American nations had reduced their dependence on the United States, although it remained their chief trading partner. Increasingly, they were tied to global economy. Oil-rich Venezuela joined Arab nations in OPEC, while Brazil worked with coffee exporting nations of Africa to support coffee prices. Many Latin American nations increased trade and cultural links to European countries. Some exported food or minerals to Asian nations. Japanese investments in Latin America, especially in Brazil, rose rapidly. Regional ties. In Latin America, as elsewhere around the world, regional trading blocs gained importance in the 1990s. Such groups created larger markets by lowering trade barriers among neighboring countries. In 1993, Mexico linked its economy with that of the United States, Canada, through NAFTA. 2 years later, the new South American trading bloc, Paraguay and Uruguay, The new South American trading bloc, Mercosur, Mercosur. 2 years later, the new South American trading bloc, Mercosur, paved the way for increased trading among Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The new groups operated alongside older blocs that linked Andean, Caribbean, and Central American nations. Andean meaning the Andes Mountains, I suppose. So that would be like the western side of South American continent, I believe. The Andes Mountains are. Talks were also underway to create a hemisphere-wide free trade zone that would be even larger than the expanding European Union. The drug wars. And this is bad. Ongoing issue. Regional cooperation was essential to efforts to control illegal drug trade. Indians in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia for centuries grow coca for their own uses. However, as drug use increased in various parts of the world, criminal gangs, also known as drug cartels, began producing and exporting larger quantities of cocaine and other drugs. By the 1970s, drug lords were reaping huge profits, which they used to bribe government officials. They also hired assassins to kill judges, journalists, and others who spoke out against them. In the 1980s, the United States declared a war on drugs To halt the flow of drugs, the United States pressed governments in Colombia, Peru, and other countries to destroy coca crops and move against the cartels. Governments cooperated, but many Latin Americans argued that the root of the problem was not the supply of drugs, but the growing demand for illegal drugs in the United States. Yeah, we're like a step away from getting there, you know. You could just say one more sentence, and then you could really teach some kids about logic. Development versus the environment. Concerns about the environment also raised some troubling issues for the Latin American world. For Latin America and the world. Developing nations insisted that they needed to exploit their land and other resources if they wanted to economic growth. You cannot talk ecology to people who are struggling to survive, said Brazilian delegate at International Conference in the Environment. Developing nations pointed out that Western powers had long since cleared many of their forests and mined their lands. What right, they asked, did industrial nations have to tell them to stop developing their resources? The most widely publicized issue was the rapid destruction of the Amazon rainforest, which occupies more than 1 million square miles in the heart of Brazil. It is rich in mineral resources needed for economic growth. It also could provide a land to millions of landless peasants. Since the 1930s, Brazil has opened more and more of this area to development. By the 1970s and 1980s, vast tracts of forest were being bulldozed and burned for farms, cattle ranches, highways, and even newly planted cities. Environmentalists argued that deforestation had enormous costs. They called the Amazon rainforest the lungs of the world because it plays a key role in absorbing poisonous carbon dioxide that the air and releasing essential oxygen. Absorbing poisonous carbon dioxide from the air and releasing essential oxygen. It has been home to 15 million species of plants and animals, which have been threatened by development. Some forms of plant life might even hold undiscovered cures for disease. Another environmental concern was a rapid development, which meant disaster for many native peoples. Isolation had protected bands of Native American forest dwellers for centuries. Land-hungry farmers, speculators, and foreign mining companies converged on the forest, threatening these ancient ways of life. Many Indians died of diseases introduced by the newcomers. Others were killed in conflicts provoked by impatient developers moving into the forest. It's serious. I'm not yawning because I'm bored of it. I'm yawning, I don't know, maybe just because I'm not breathing deeply enough during my normal day. And when I'm talking for a bit of an extended period of time, my body's saying, take a deep breath. But it also might just be that I'm bored. Migration, Latin American immigration to the United States increased rapidly after the 1970s. Poverty, civil war, and repressive governments led many people to flee their homelands. Like earlier immigrants, they sought freedom and economic opportunity. By the end of the 1990s, the United States had more than 11 million Latin American immigrants. Many immigrants entered the United States illegally. Many immigrants entered the United States legally and eventually became citizens. A large number, however, were illegal immigrants. As a result, pressure to increased in the United States to halt illegal immigration, deny services to illegal aliens, and return them to their countries of origin. Let's try that again. There's a hat trick here. Thank you for watching. My name is John Michael, and God bless. Thank you. 2 more episodes.